Every year, on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, the high priest of Israel would send a goat into the wilderness to a demon he addressed by name. The ritual is still in your Bible. Leviticus chapter 16. You can open it right now and read it. Most pastors will never preach on it. And to understand why, you have to travel 4,000 years back in time, to a single mountain in northern Israel, where 200 angels swore a blood oath to defy God together. That mountain is still there. Israeli soldiers guard its summit today. Tourists ski on its slopes every winter, and at its base, Jesus himself would one day stand and declare war on the gates of hell. This is the story of Mount Hermon, the place where angels fell, the place that gave birth to giants, and the place that, if the ancient texts are right, may still hold one of the darkest secrets in biblical history. To understand why this mountain matters, you have to see it. Mount Hermon sits at the meeting point of three modern countries: Lebanon to the north, Syria to the east, Israel to the south. At nearly 9,200 feet, it is the highest point in the entire Levant. From its summit, you can see the Sea of Galilee 40 miles to the south. On a clear day, you can see all the way to the Mediterranean. Snow covers its peak for 9 months of the year. The water that melts off the Hermon feeds the Jordan River, which feeds the Sea of Galilee, which feeds the land of Israel itself. Every drop of water that Jesus drank during his ministry came at some point from this mountain. But the ancient world didn't see Hermon the way we see mountains today. The Canaanites worshipped it as a god. They called it Baal Hermon, Lord Hermon. The Sidonians called it Syrian. The Amorites called it Senir. Every ancient culture that came near this mountain gave it a name, and every one of those names carried religious weight. You didn't just walk up Mount Hermon. You made pilgrimage, you brought offerings, you were entering divine territory. However, the Hebrew name is the one that matters most. In Hebrew, the word Hermon comes from the root herem, and herem doesn't just mean sacred or holy, it means something much darker. Herem means devoted to destruction. A thing placed under herem is a thing that has been cursed, set apart, forbidden. In the Hebrew Bible, when an entire city was put under herem, it meant every living thing in that city had to be destroyed. Nothing could be saved. Nothing could be taken. So why would anyone name a mountain the Cursed One? Some scholars believe the mountain got this name because of what the ancient peoples remembered had happened there. Something so terrible that they refused to climb it. Something so forbidden that the mountain itself was marked as accursed ground. But remembered by whom? Marked by whom? And for what? For that, we need to open a book that your Bible probably doesn't include. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy was throwing rocks into caves near the Dead Sea when he heard something shatter. He climbed down to investigate. What he found would rewrite the history of biblical scholarship. Inside those caves were clay jars. Inside the jars were scrolls, over 900 of them, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among those scrolls, in multiple fragments, scholars found copies of a book that had been quietly removed from the Christian Bible more than 1,600 years earlier, the Book of Enoch. Now, Enoch is not an obscure figure. He is mentioned in Genesis chapter 5. He is the great-grandfather of Noah. The Bible says something strange about him. It says Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He didn't die. He was taken. One of only 2 people in the Bible this ever happens to. The Book of Enoch claims to be his account of what he saw during those journeys with God. And the first section of this book, called the Book of the Watchers, describes in detail what happened on Mount Hermon. For centuries, this book was considered scripture. The Jewish historian Josephus quoted it. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Irenaeus treated it as authoritative. The New Testament itself quotes directly from it. In the Book of Jude, verse 14, the author writes, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men. The quote that follows is pulled word for word from 1 Enoch chapter 1. And Jude does not stop there. 4 verses earlier, in verse 6, the same author makes a direct reference to the watchers themselves. He writes, And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. That is not a loose reference. That is a direct paraphrase of 1 Enoch chapter 10. And the Apostle Peter does the same thing. In 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4, he writes, For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, to be kept until the judgment. 2 of the most important letters in the New Testament, written by 2 different apostles, both reference the same event. Angels who sinned, who are now bound, waiting for final judgment. They are not talking about Satan's rebellion. That story is different. Satan is not bound. He is still active according to the New Testament. These chained angels are something else. They are the watchers of Mount Hermon. So why did the book that described them disappear? By the 4th century, as the church was consolidating what would become the official canon of the Bible, the Book of Enoch was pushed out. The official reason was that its authorship couldn't be verified. The unofficial reason is simpler, and many scholars now argue it openly. What the Book of Enoch described was considered too dangerous for ordinary believers to read, so they removed it, and they did not tell anyone what they had taken away. But one group kept it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never removed it. To this day, the Book of Enoch is part of their Bible. It survived in Ethiopia in the Ge'ez language for over 1,000 years, while the rest of the world forgot it existed, until those scrolls were found in the caves. When scholars translated the Qumran fragments, they discovered that the community that hid those scrolls, the Essenes, had considered the Book of Enoch absolutely essential. They had more copies of it than almost any other text. They believed it explained something about human history that Genesis only hinted at, and the story it told began on Mount Hermon. Here is what that book says. In the days when humans were beginning to multiply on the earth, something was watching. The Book of Enoch calls them the Watchers. In Hebrew, Irin. They were a class of angelic beings whose specific job, according to the text, was to observe humanity, to guard, to guide when asked, but not to interfere, not to intervene, and, above all, never to cross certain boundaries. There were 200 of them who would eventually break that rule, and the text is specific about when this happened. It says, the descent of the Watchers took place in the days of Jared. Jared is a real figure in the Hebrew Bible. He is listed in Genesis chapter 5, the 6th generation from Adam, the father of Enoch himself. And in Hebrew, his name is not random. Jared. Yared. It comes from the root yared, which means to come down, to descend. Enoch's father was literally named Descent. Some ancient rabbis believed this was not a coincidence. They taught that Jared was given that name because he was born in the generation when the Watchers came down. His entire life overlapped with the event. His son Enoch grew up with the knowledge of what had happened and eventually wrote it down in the book that bears his name. The timeline, if you take the genealogies at face value, places the descent around the year 3500 BC, before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the earliest cities of Mesopotamia reach their peak. This is deep antiquity. And according to the text, the first major rebellion on earth had already happened. The Book of Enoch says the watchers looked down from their positions and saw the daughters of men, and they wanted them. But one of them, a watcher named Semjaza, understood what they were about to do. He called the others together and said something that reveals the nature of their rebellion. He said, "I fear that you will not actually want to do this, and I will be the only one to pay the penalty for a great sin." So they made a pact. They all swore an oath together. They bound themselves to each other with mutual curses, so that if any one of them tried to back out, they would all be destroyed together. No one could escape the consequences. No one could turn back. And the place where they stood when they swore this oath, according to 1 Enoch chapter 6, verse 6, was the summit of Mount Hermon. This is why the mountain was cursed. This is why it was called Hermon, the devoted one, because this is where the rebellion happened. This is the place where 200 heavenly beings chose to abandon their assignment and descend into the physical world. And they weren't invisible when they came. The text lists the names of the 20 chieftains who led them: Semjaza, Azazel, Armaros, Kokabel, and 16 others, each one with an area of expertise, each one with something specific to bring to humanity. Because the Watchers didn't just come down to take wives. That was part of it. But it wasn't the whole plan. They came down to teach, and what they taught would change human civilization forever. But before we get into what they taught, you need to understand one thing. The Book of Enoch insists that everything that followed, everything that went wrong with the ancient world, every dark thing that human beings learned to do, traces back to this single moment on this single mountain. This is where it all started. The first thing Azazel taught humanity was how to kill. According to 1 Enoch chapter 8, he taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught them metallurgy. He taught them to work iron and bronze in ways that nature alone would never have revealed. Before Azazel, the text implies humans fought with rocks and sticks. After Azazel, they had the technology to commit war on a scale never seen before. But that was only the beginning. Azazel also taught women how to paint their faces. He taught them to darken their eyes, to adorn themselves with jewels, to dye their hair. The text treats this not as harmless vanity, but as something spiritually corrosive. The Watchers were teaching humanity to seduce, to deceive, to present something that wasn't real. Then came the others. Barakijal taught astrology, the reading of the stars to predict the future. Others taught the signs of the sun, the signs of the moon, the cloud magic, the casting of spells, the breaking of enchantments. All forbidden knowledge, all handed down to humans who should never have received it. But two names in particular demand attention. Penemu, one of the most important Watchers, taught humans how to write with ink on paper. The Book of Enoch treats this as a corruption, not because writing itself was evil, but because Penemu taught humans to record things that should have been forgotten, to preserve lies, to falsify. And then there was Casteja. Casteja, according to 1 Enoch chapter 69, taught humanity the secret of the serpent. He taught the striking of the embryo in the womb. He taught the striking of souls. Scholars disagree on exactly what this means, but the plain reading is disturbing. Casteja taught humans how to perform abortions, how to curse the unborn, and how to attack the spirit itself. All of this, according to the ancient text, came from that one night on Mount Hermon. But here is what is often missed. The Watchers didn't force any of this on humanity. They offered it, they traded it, in exchange for what they wanted. And what they wanted was the daughters of men, and so the trade was made. Technology for intimacy, knowledge for access, and the children that came from those unions were not human. The text says they were something else, something much, much larger. Genesis chapter 6 contains one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible. Most people skip right over it. Pastors rarely preach on it. And when they do, they usually spiritualize it into something safer, something less disturbing, something that does not contradict what you already believe about the Bible. Try asking your pastor about Genesis 6 directly. Ask him what the sons of God were, and who the Nephilim were, and why the passage is in there at all. Watch what happens. Because the plain reading of the Hebrew is almost impossible to accept if you have grown up in Western Christianity. And yet the ancient Jewish rabbis considered it one of the most important texts in the Torah. Here is what it actually says. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That is the entire account in 4 verses. But every word is loaded. The phrase sons of God in Hebrew is Bene ha-Elohim. Everywhere else it appears in the Old Testament, in Job, in the Psalms. It refers exclusively to angelic beings, not humans, not a bloodline, angels. The word Nephilim is even more loaded. Most translations render it as giants, but the Hebrew root naphal means to fall. The Nephilim were the fallen ones, or, as some rabbis taught, the ones who caused others to fall. Their children, the hybrid offspring of watchers and women. The Book of Enoch is much more specific about what these beings were. It says they grew to heights of 300 cubits. Now that number is almost certainly symbolic, but even if we scale it down to what other ancient texts suggest, we're talking about humanoid beings standing 10 to 15 feet tall, stronger than any human, longer lived, more intelligent, and, according to the text, utterly ravenous. First, Enoch chapter 7 describes what happened when these hybrids ran out of normal food. They turned on humanity. The text says they consumed the labors of all the men until men could no longer sustain them. Then the giants turned against men in order to devour them. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. They ate one another's flesh, and they drank the blood. Read that again. They drank the blood. They ate human flesh. The offspring of the Watchers had become, in the oldest sense of the word, something like cannibals, predators, beings that existed only to consume, and they were multiplying faster than humans could reproduce. The earth, the text says, cried out. Most people think of Noah's flood as a story about human wickedness, about a world that had simply become too sinful for God to tolerate, and that is part of it. But the Book of Enoch tells you what specific kind of wickedness had pushed the world past the point of no return. It was the Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 says the earth had become filled with violence, and that all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. The Hebrew word for corrupted there is shachath. It can mean morally corrupt, but it can also mean biologically corrupt, altered, damaged, something that should not exist. Some rabbinic traditions taught that by the time of Noah, the Nephilim bloodline had spread so widely that only a handful of purely human lineages remained. The flood, in this reading, wasn't just punishment for sin. It was a reset, a necessary cleansing of a genome that had been contaminated by the descent of the Watchers. And the Bible hints at this directly when it describes Noah. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 says, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation." The Hebrew word for blameless is tamim, and tamim is interesting. In every other context in the Old Testament, when it refers to a living creature, it means physically unblemished. A tamim lamb is a lamb without deformity. A tamim priest is a priest with no physical defects. Some scholars have argued that when Genesis calls Noah tamim, it is telling you something very specific. It is telling you that Noah's bloodline, out of everyone left alive, was still purely human. The flood came. The Watchers themselves, according to 1 Enoch, were bound in chains beneath the earth to await final judgment. Their bodies were destroyed. But the book says something interesting about their offspring. The text says that when the Nephilim died in the flood, their physical bodies perished. But their spirits, being hybrid, did not have a place to go. They were not fully angelic, so they could not return to heaven. They were not fully human, so they did not go to the grave. Instead, they became something new. The spirits of the Nephilim, the text says, would wander the earth forever as evil spirits, unclean spirits, spirits that cause affliction, spirits that seek out human bodies to inhabit because they themselves no longer have any. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact category of beings that Jesus will spend his entire ministry casting out of people. But here is what is often missed, and what makes the story of the Watchers one of the most disturbing in all of biblical scholarship. The names did not disappear. One of them in particular survived into the holiest ritual of the Jewish calendar, the one we touched at the very beginning of this video, and most Christians today, and most Jews, have no idea what they are actually looking at when they read about it. His name was Azazel. We met him earlier. He was the Watcher who taught humans metallurgy and weapons, the one who taught women to paint their faces, the one the Book of Enoch calls the chief architect of the rebellion, after Semjaza himself. According to 1 Enoch chapter 10, God sent the archangel Raphael specifically to deal with Azazel. The text says, "Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert which is in Dudael, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever." Azazel, in other words, was to be buried alive in the desert until the final judgment, and 1,500 years later, that same desert would host one of the strangest rituals in the entire Hebrew Bible. Leviticus chapter 16 describes the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, the one day when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, and stand in the presence of God himself. The ritual required 2 goats. The first goat was sacrificed on the altar, and its blood was taken into the Holy of Holies as a sin offering for the nation. The second goat was different. The high priest would lay his hands on its head and confess over it all the sins of the people of Israel. Then the goat, now carrying all the sin of the nation, would be led out of the city, led out into the wilderness, into the desert, to be sent, the text says, to Azazel. Most English Bibles translate this as for the scapegoat or as a scapegoat, but the Hebrew text is not ambiguous. It uses a proper noun, la Azazel, to Azazel. For over 1,000 years, on the holiest day of their calendar, the priests of Israel sent a goat burdened with the sins of the entire nation out into the wilderness, specifically to the place where Azazel was chained. as if to say, "These sins you inspired, take them back. They belong to you." The ritual was performed every single year until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The Mishnah, the collection of Jewish oral law, describes the procedure in detail. The goat was led by a designated man into the wilderness to a specific cliff, and there the man would push the goat off the cliff, sending it tumbling down onto the rocks below. The text specifies that the goat had to die. Its bones had to break. It could not be allowed to return to the camp. The symbolism could not be more clear. The sins of the people were not just being removed, they were being returned to the one whose rebellion had introduced them in the first place. And here is the part that Christians especially need to understand. When Jesus died, he died during the Passover cycle, but the Book of Hebrews insists that his real theological context was the Day of Atonement. His entire mission, according to Hebrews chapter 9, was the fulfillment of Yom Kippur. He was both goats. He was the sacrificed one whose blood entered the true Holy of Holies, and he was the one who carried the sins of the people away forever. The pattern that began on Mount Hermon with Azazel's rebellion was being answered on the cross. Permanently, finally. Azazel had given humanity the knowledge that corrupted them. Jesus gave humanity the sacrifice that redeemed them. The rebellion on the mountain had a price, and it was being paid. But before we get to the cross, there is one more piece of the ancient story you need to understand. Because the flood didn't actually end the giants, some of them somehow came back. The region directly at the base of Mount Hermon on the eastern side is called Bashan. Today it falls mostly within the Golan Heights. It is rough, rocky terrain, volcanic, dotted with strange stone structures that archaeologists still cannot fully explain. In the ancient world, Bashan had a reputation. In Ugaritic texts, which predate the Hebrew Bible, the region of Bashan was called Bthn, which literally means serpent. The Ugaritic religion associated this region with the underworld, with the realm of the dead, with beings that came from beneath. It was considered a liminal place, a gateway, and when the Israelites entered the Promised Land under Moses, this is the region they had to conquer first. They came up against a king named Og. Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11 contains one of the most casually shocking verses in the entire Bible. It says, "For only Og the king of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Refaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. 9 cubits is roughly 13 feet. 4 cubits is roughly 6 feet. Og's bed was 13 feet long. The Bible is telling you plainly that this man was a giant. But the really important word in that verse is Refaim, because the Refaim were not just big humans. The Hebrew Bible uses several words for giant peoples: Nephilim, Anakim, Emim, Zuzim, and Refaim. And the Refaim are consistently associated with the dead, with the underworld, with something ancient that should not have survived. In multiple Old Testament passages, the word Refaim is used to describe the spirits of dead kings in the underworld. It is the Hebrew word for the shades, the ghosts of ancient rulers. And yet here, in the land of Bashan, Og is called the last of the Refaim, a physical survivor of a people who should not exist. Archaeology gets even stranger when you look at what is actually in Bashan. There is a structure there called Rujm el-Hiri, the stone heap of the wild cat. It is a massive concentric ring of stones, over 500 feet in diameter. It was built sometime between 3000 and 2500 BC. Nobody knows who built it. Nobody knows what it was for. It predates the Hebrews in the region, and some scholars have connected it to the ancient cult of the Refaim, a place where the dead kings were believed to be called back from the underworld. Bashan was not normal ground. The ancient peoples knew it, the Israelites knew it, and when Moses commanded the total destruction of Og's kingdom, he was carrying out a herem order, the same word that named the mountain. Devoted to destruction, nothing left alive, because what was there was not supposed to be there. But the giants did not end with Og. Even after Moses destroyed the kingdom of Bashan, even after Joshua conquered the Promised Land, the text keeps mentioning them, over and over, in places they should not exist. Numbers chapter 13. The spies Moses sends into Canaan return terrified. They report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them." Deuteronomy chapter 9. Moses warns Israel about the Anakim. He says, "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today, to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourselves, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak?" Joshua chapter 11. Joshua spends years hunting down the Anakim in the hill country of Hebron, Debir, and Anab. The text is emphatic. He left none remaining except in 3 specific cities, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Remember those 3 cities, because 400 years later, a young shepherd boy named David will walk into a valley called Elah to fight a Philistine champion from the city of Gath. A man described in 1 Samuel chapter 17 as nearly 10 feet tall, a man whose armor weighed 125 pounds, a man whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, Goliath. Goliath was not an ordinary big man. 1 Samuel specifically calls him a descendant of the Refaim. He had brothers, 4 of them, also giants mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 21. One had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The same Refaim, the same bloodline that Moses had tried to eliminate in Bashan, the same people whose king Og had slept in a 13-foot bed. They had scattered, they had hidden, and they had kept breeding. For nearly 1,500 years after the flood, the Bible keeps telling you the same thing. The giants are not gone. They are just smaller in number, and they are concentrated in specific places. One of those places was the city of Gath, where Goliath was from. The other, the original stronghold, was the region around Mount Hermon, and all of this territory, every square foot of the land of the giants, existed in the shadow of one specific mountain. But the story does not end in the Old Testament, because 1,200 years after Og of Bashan was destroyed, a Jewish rabbi would walk his disciples to the base of Mount Hermon. He would stand in front of a cave that every pagan in the region believed was the literal doorway to hell. And he would say something that no one in history had ever said before. In the 1st century, there was a city at the base of Mount Hermon called Caesarea Philippi. It sat on a natural spring that gushed out of the side of the mountain itself. The Greeks and Romans had built an elaborate religious complex around that spring. Temples, shrines, altars. At the center of it all was a cave. The cave was wide and deep and filled with water. No one knew how far down it went. The Greeks called it the Grotto of Pan. Pan, the goat-legged god of wild places, of chaos, of sexuality, of fear. The word panic comes from his name. The locals believed something specific about this cave. They believed it was an entrance to the underworld. the doorway through which the gods of the harvest descended into Hades each winter, and through which they returned each spring. When the rains came, the spring would gush stronger, and they believed it was because the gods were coming back up through that hole in the mountain. To test whether the gods accepted their offerings, worshippers would perform a ritual. They would sacrifice animals and throw the bodies into the water of the cave. If the body disappeared, the gods had accepted it. If blood rose to the surface, they had rejected it. The rituals did not stop at animal sacrifice. Caesarea Philippi was known throughout the Roman world for its sexual rites, temple prostitution, fertility worship. Some historians have suggested that worshippers engaged in ritual acts with goats as part of Pan's cult. This was not a clean place. This was, in every sense that the word implied to an ancient Jew, a gateway to hell, a place of demons, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, and the Jews of the 1st century had an even older reason to avoid it. Because they knew, they remembered, they had not forgotten. This was Mount Hermon. This was the mountain where the Watchers descended. This was the ground that had been cursed. This was where it all began. And now, 2,000 years later, the pagans had built their doorway to hell on the exact spot where the doorway had first opened. This is the context you need to understand. Matthew chapter 16. The text says that Jesus took his disciples specifically to Caesarea Philippi. Why? He was a Jewish rabbi. His disciples were Jewish fishermen. No observant Jew would have willingly gone near that place. They would have walked miles out of their way to avoid it. But Jesus took them there on purpose. And while they were standing there, almost certainly within sight of the grotto of Pan, within sight of Mount Hermon looming above them, he asked them a question. "Who do people say that I am?" They gave him various answers. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. Then he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter, standing at the gate of hell itself, with the cursed mountain behind him, said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Most Christians read that verse and imagine Jesus saying it in some neutral setting, a classroom, a field, a boat, but he said it here, at Mount Hermon, in front of the cave the pagans called the gates of hell, on the exact ground where the Watchers had descended 4,000 years before. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was standing on the battlefield and declaring war. He was saying, in effect, this is where it started, and this is where it ends. I'm going to build something right here, on this cursed rock, that hell itself cannot stop. And then, 6 days later, he went one step further. He climbed the mountain. Matthew chapter 17 begins with a strange geographical note. It says, "And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves." For centuries, Christian tradition identified this mountain as Mount Tabor, a modest hill in Galilee. But Mount Tabor is a problem. It is nowhere near Caesarea Philippi. It is not a high mountain. And the text specifies that this happened after 6 days, meaning 6 days after Jesus and the disciples had been standing at the gates of hell. A growing number of scholars today argue that the mountain of the Transfiguration was not Tabor at all. It was Hermon. The geography works. The disciples were already at the base of Hermon. The text calls it a high mountain, and Hermon is the highest peak in the entire region. 6 days of climbing would put them near the summit. And if they were on Hermon, then the symbolism of what happened next becomes almost unbearable. The text says that on top of that mountain, Jesus was transfigured. His face began to shine like the sun. His clothes became white as light. And 2 figures appeared with him, Moses and Elijah. Think about where this is happening. On the exact summit where 200 watchers descended to corrupt humanity, Jesus ascended to reveal his glory to humanity. On the ground where angels once fell, the Son of Man was lifted up. On the mountain the ancient texts called Hermon, the cursed one, the devoted to destruction, Jesus stood in blinding light with Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the greatest of the prophets. The 2 human figures who, in all of Hebrew scripture, most clearly represented God's covenant with humanity. And then a voice came from heaven, the same voice that had spoken at his baptism. It said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The ancient rebellion was being answered on its own ground. Every story has a beginning and an end. And if the Book of Enoch is right, that the corruption of the world began on the summit of Mount Hermon, then the Gospels are telling you something extraordinary. The repair of the world began on the exact same spot, the place where heaven first fell to earth. And then, millennia later, the place where heaven touched earth again. But this time, not to corrupt it, to save it. But there is one more thing that Jesus said about all of this, and it may be the most unsettling piece of the entire story. During his ministry, Jesus was asked about the end of the age. When would it come? What would it look like? How would anyone know? His answer is recorded in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 17, and it is short, almost throwaway. But every scholar who has wrestled with the Watcher's tradition has had to reckon with it. He said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man." Most Christians read that as a general statement about wickedness. People were bad in Noah's time. People will be bad in the last days. The parallel is moral, but read it against the Book of Enoch. Read it against Genesis chapter 6. Read it against everything we have just talked about. What were the days of Noah actually like? They were the days when angelic beings crossed the boundary between worlds, when hybrid children walked the earth, when ancient forbidden knowledge was being offered to humanity through beings who should never have come down. The days of Noah were not just morally bad, they were supernaturally contaminated. And Jesus said, "That is what it will be like again." The Book of Enoch agrees. In its final sections, it contains a prophecy of what it calls the last days. It describes the Watchers being released from their chains for one final rebellion. It describes the spirits of the Nephilim rising up. It describes a world in which the ancient corruption returns in full force, just long enough for final judgment to fall. And if you pay attention to the world around you today, you may start to notice something else. The same things the Watchers taught humanity 4,000 years ago are being celebrated now as progress. The same boundaries they violated are being dissolved. The same forbidden knowledge is being rebranded as enlightenment. Whether that is coincidence or pattern is a question each person has to answer alone. Something began on Mount Hermon 4,000 years ago. It was answered at the cross, but the ancient texts insist over and over that the story is not finished. And there is one more clue, buried in Israel's own history, that the mountain's pull on the human soul has never truly stopped. When the 12 tribes of Israel entered the Promised Land, they were each given territory. The tribe of Dan was given land on the Mediterranean coast, but they didn't stay there. They couldn't hold it against the Philistines. And so they migrated north, looking for unclaimed territory. They found it at the base of Mount Hermon. The Book of Judges, chapter 18, tells the story. 600 warriors of Dan came north, attacked a peaceful Canaanite city called Laish, slaughtered its inhabitants, and renamed the city Dan. But on their way north, they had stopped at the house of a man named Micah, and Micah had built a private shrine, a carved image, an ephod, household gods. He had even hired a personal priest, and the men of Dan took all of it. The idol, the priest, the ephod, the gods. They took them to their new city, and they set them up as the religion of their tribe. At the base of Mount Hermon, the tribe of Dan became the first tribe of Israel to institutionalize idolatry. Centuries later, when the kingdom of Israel split in two, King Jeroboam made a political calculation. He knew that his people were still going to Jerusalem to worship, and he knew that if they kept doing that, they would eventually want to be reunited with Judah. So he set up two alternative worship sites, two golden calves, one in the south at Bethel and one in the north at Dan, at the base of Mount Hermon. For the next 200 years, a golden calf stood at the foot of the mountain where the watchers had descended. Israelites made pilgrimage there, burned offerings, celebrated feasts, on the exact ground that was supposed to be under Herem. The prophet Amos would eventually declare judgment on that altar. The Assyrians would eventually destroy it. But the pattern is striking. Every time a false religion sprouted in Israel, it seemed to find its way back to this one mountain, as if something in the ground there was calling them, as if the curse was still active, and the mountain itself has not gone quiet. In December 2024, after the sudden collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, Israeli forces crossed into Syrian territory and took control of the Syrian side of Mount Hermon. For the first time in over 50 years, the entire summit came under a single foreign military command. You probably did not see the headlines. They were brief. Mount Hermon is a strategic asset, the report said. Nothing more. But ask yourself this: out of every mountain on earth, why is this the one that sits on the border of 3 countries and a United Nations observation line? Why is this the one that sees war every generation? Why is this the one that foreign soldiers keep trying to control over and over for thousands of years? The Book of Enoch said the Watchers would one day be released at the end of the age for one final rebellion. It named the mountain where they had descended, and 2,000 years after Christ, the scholars who study these texts seriously are no longer a fringe minority. Academics like Michael Heiser, teachers at Bible Project, a new generation of Bible readers who are quietly returning to Genesis chapter 6 and reading it the way the ancient rabbis did. Literally, not as metaphor, not as myth, as history. Most people who visit Mount Hermon today have no idea what happened there. The Book of Enoch is still being read in Ethiopia, in university libraries, in religious communities that never let it go. Genesis chapter 6 is still in your Bible, even if most preachers skip it. The gates of hell are still there at Banias, still flowing, still pouring water down into the Jordan River. And the mountain stands where it has always stood, watching, holding its secret, the place where angels descended, the place where giants were born, the place where the Son of God declared war on hell itself, and where the light of heaven broke through for just a moment to show the disciples what the end of the story would look like. One mountain, 2 descents, and a story that, if you read the ancient texts, is nowhere near finished. Before you go, one question. Had you ever heard any of this before? The Azazel ritual, the Watchers, the meaning of the name Hermon. The reason Jesus chose that exact mountain. Had anyone ever told you these things existed in the Bible? Let me know in the comments, because I am genuinely curious how many people are hearing this for the first time today. And if this surprised you, you are not ready for what the Book of Enoch says comes next. Because the rebellion on Mount Hermon was the first descent, but Enoch's final prophecy describes a second one, at the end of the age, with consequences far worse than the first. That video is on screen now. Click it. Subscribe for more stories like this one, the ones that never made it into the sermons you grew up hearing, and I will see you in the next one.